Today we'll be talking about Europe and its relationship with the Americas, starting in the year 1500 to 1700 CE. So you can see in this map that the primary European nations that were engaged in this age of discovery were Spain, Portugal, France, and England. Portugal was actually a little bit more interested in trying to get around the southern tip of Africa and into the Indian Ocean because they felt that that was the quickest way to get to the Spice Islands, which were the source of large amounts of wealth for the European countries, whereas it was the Spanish, the French, and the English that concentrated more on North and South America. So just 2 years after Columbus's voyage, Portugal and Spain have a treaty called the Treaty of Tortosius. And what they did in that treaty is they split the oceans of the world into two hemispheres. And the Portuguese got the hemisphere around the African continent as well as the Indian Ocean, and Spain got the rest of the Atlantic Ocean and the entirety of the Pacific Ocean. Now, they didn't really know how large the Pacific Ocean was. It was just sort of it was like a relative thing. But this then meant that the Portuguese really only settle and colonize the easternmost part of South America because the rest of South America and all of North America fall within the jurisdiction of the Spanish. Now, it's important to note that the only people that recognized the Treaty of Tordesillas were the Spanish and the Portuguese. So it's not as if the French were like, "Oh, well, we can't sail into the Indian Ocean." That didn't happen. This was just an arrangement between Portugal and Spain that had a much greater impact on colonization of the Americas than it did on who gets to control which ocean. So now we're going to look at some basic patterns and commonalities of the experience of both the native peoples of North and South America and the experiences of the colonizers. So, as we know, all across the Americas, the native population was decimated within decades of the arrival of the Europeans. And so, we're going to just look at a few of those cultures. And we're going to start with the Taino because those are the first quote unquote Native Americans that Europeans came into contact with. Columbus met the Taino on the island of Hispaniola. For context, Hispaniola is it's the island that contains the modern nations of the Dominican Republic and Haiti. So Columbus met the Taino on Hispaniola, and the Europeans were shocked at how primitive the Taino were. The fact that they really didn't even have weapons kind of surprised them, which led Columbus to this quote that they do not know what evil is. Now, one could argue that perhaps that day they met evil because of the massacres and the depopulation in both Cuba and Hispaniola. And just to kind of see the impact of violence and disease, before Columbus, the Caribbean islands supported a population of about a half a million Taino, and post Columbus, there were only 2,000 Taino left. So, moving into modern day Mexico and Central America, briefly touch on the Aztecs. And you may know from other courses that you have taken that the Aztecs were one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the year 1519 when Cortez arrived. And in fact, Tenochtitlan, which I probably mispronounced, was as big as the largest European cities in 1519. The Aztecs were an imperialistic power within their region, and they frequently raided smaller nations and chiefdoms to get victims for their human sacrifices, which were a major part of the religion of the Aztec people. Moving into South America, the Inca were attacked by Pizarro and his small band of Spanish conquistadors. As we know from Guns, Germs, and Steel, the Spanish had infinitely superior technology. They wore plate armor, they rode horses, they had primitive firearms. So they capture the emperor Atahualpa, they kill him. Eventually, they conquer the Incan capital of Cusco, and that causes the Inca to have to retreat to a mountainous city, very difficult to attack, called Machu Picchu. And they are able to maintain control over Machu Picchu until 1572. Eventually, there were royal decrees from the King of Spain, which attempted to limit the mistreatment of the native peoples of the former Incan Empire. Moving on to North America, and again, there just as is true in Central and South America, there are many different civilizations. We're only going to look at the Powhatan Confederacy for now, and the Powhatan Confederacy existed in the modern day region of Virginia and Maryland, and there were 24,000 people or so in the Confederacy. It was, again, it was a collection of smaller groups of natives who came together for political, military, economic benefits. And they were pretty dismissive of those original English settlers because it was pretty clear that they had no idea what they were doing. But eventually, as Jamestown sort of becomes more secure and more permanent, there becomes this cycle of violence between the Confederacy and the English colonists. And unfortunately, there was just too much attrition in battle. They were just losing too many warriors in battle with the English. And that combined with the superior technology that the English had, and also more importantly, combined with Eurasian diseases, it was just devastating to the Powhatan Confederacy. And just about 60 years after the arrival of the English, the population of the Confederacy is about 8% of what it had been prior to the arrival of the English. So different European countries had different goals from the colonization and conquest of the Americas. And that had to do with just their own internal domestic priorities. So the Spanish were pretty much only interested in gold and silver. The French were more interested in trading with the natives for fur as well as whale oil, which was used for lighting and other industrial purposes. The English were pretty much just there for drugs. Sorry, folks, but sugar is a drug. It has a psychoactive effect on the brain, as well as tobacco. So the English were drug dealers. They wanted to sell as much sugar and tobacco as possible back in Europe. The Portuguese, similarly, they were interested in sugar for an export market as well as spices, which is the main drive for the Portuguese going into East Asia. And the Dutch, as the Dutch were in the Netherlands in Europe, they're really only interested in trade and finance. So, the Dutch come in a little bit after the English and the French and the Spanish, but they see opportunities to trade with natives and with other European settlers on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. This period is also the age of piracy, and there's a couple of different types of piracy that are going on, and we're also not just talking about that in the Caribbean. So the British and the French attacked the Spanish galleons, which were full of gold and silver, on a pretty regular basis as they were crossing the Atlantic or as they were transiting through the Caribbean. In addition to that level of piracy, we also have Muslims in the Mediterranean who were raiding the Spanish coast primarily to gain hostages and or slaves. And then, as was mentioned in a previous lecture, the British engaged in privateering, which is piracy that is sponsored by a government. And so British privateers would again attack those Spanish galleons in the middle of the Atlantic and steal the Spanish gold. And that continued to deepen the animosity between Spain and England, which would eventually lead to war and the destruction of the Spanish Armada in 1588. Some countries in Europe did not actually directly take over the lands that they colonized in the Americas. England, in particular, liked to use what were called charter companies. And the way that that worked is the monarch would give a specific royal charter to a company. Basically, and that company had shareholders in a way that modern corporations have shareholders. And those companies then got exclusive trading rights and settlement rights in a specific geographic area. And so that removed the English king from the equation in a direct manner. So those charter companies were in charge of trade, they were in charge of exploration, and they were also in charge of conquest, which means that they often had their own armies as well. There were other nations that did it. France did it a little bit, but England was really dominant. And just two examples of these charter companies are the Massachusetts Bay Company, which settled Massachusetts, as well as the British East India Company, which when we get to looking at India, you will see how important the East India Company was. In addition to engaging in trade and exploration, the charter companies also functioned as colonial governments, at least until charters eventually get revoked and the European nations take over their colonies directly. We will now spend some time looking at the different European nations and what their interests were in the early days of the colonization of the Americas. In the 1400s, the Portuguese start slowly working their way down the sub-Saharan African coast. Along the way, they discover the Canary Islands, which are just off of the coast of West Africa, as well as the Azores, which are a little bit further out in the Atlantic Ocean. In order to gain prestige amongst the rest of the European nations, Portugal captured a city on the coast of North Africa called Ceuta. And as they worked their way down the African coastline, they started to build fortresses on islands off of the coast of Africa. And those fortresses become these trading centers. Eventually, as sugar plantations begin to take off in the Americas, the Portuguese also enter the slave trade. But ultimately, as we've already said, Portugal is much more interested in expanding colonies in the Indian Ocean region. So, whether that's the coast of East Africa or the Indian subcontinent or the islands themselves, that's really where Portugal's trade was focused. Now, in addition, they also briefly claimed Newfoundland, which is right off the coast of Canada, but they never made any attempts to settle it or defend it. And eventually, those claims were taken over by other European countries. So the one part of the Americas that Portugal did end up settling was Brazil. And the Treaty of Tortosius divided up the world between Spain and Portugal. Only the easternmost part of South America was left for the Portuguese to control. Now, there wasn't any gold in this area, so that made it somewhat less valuable, and probably the reason why Spain didn't immediately conquer Brazil. But eventually, Portugal is conquered by Spain in 1580. And so once Spain has control of Portugal, then of course it has control of the Portuguese colonies as well. By 1600, Brazil was in fact the leading sugar producer, and they were producing that sugar for the most part using slave labor of the indigenous population. Now, that led to a conflict between Jesuit missionaries and those sugar planters because the Jesuits believed that slavery was wrong, and so they didn't really want that practice. And ultimately, the solution that they landed upon were that they were only be enslaving any people who had taken up arms against the Portuguese, and that those people, those who were captured in war, would be enslaved. But eventually, as with much of the rest of the Americas, you see the colonizers eventually switch and move away from using indigenous peoples as slaves to using West African people as slaves. So prior to 1700, Spain had by far the largest empire in the Americas. And those efforts were, as we know, initially led by an Italian named Christopher Columbus. And even though he is still celebrated to a degree in America, and there is a national holiday named after him, he's not a great guy at all. Obviously, he leads the destruction of the Taino at the very beginning, massacring people on the island of Hispaniola. Um, but he also wasn't a terribly honest guy because he kept sending reports home to Spain about all of these amazing gold mines in Hispaniola that did not exist. So, the king would kind of reach out to Columbus and say, "Hey, what's going on? Is everything cool? Am I going to be making money off of this thing?" And Columbus is like, "No, it's totally cool. It's going to be great. You're going to make so much money." And it never came because, of course, there was no gold in Hispaniola. Now, eventually, after a couple more tries, Columbus did end up finding some wealth because he found huge pearl beds off of the coast of Venezuela in 1498. Now, you have an idea of what a pearl looks like, right? It's a little small sphere. It's got kind of a shiny surface. Well, the pearls that they were pulling out of these pearl beds off of the coast of Venezuela were the size of baseballs and grapefruits. Um, so that did lead to a fairly large amount of wealth for Columbus towards the end of his life. We've talked about the Treaty of Tortosius a few times. In 1519, Cortez lands in Mexico and burns his ships and leads his forces to conquer the entire Aztec Empire. He didn't do it entirely by himself. He allied with some of the enemies of the Aztecs, but he brought down that entire empire and eventually ended up building Mexico City on the ruins of Tenochtitlan. And then also as a review, in 1531, Pizarro lands in South America and defeats the Incan Empire. Spain's main reason for being in the Americas is to acquire wealth, and they took massive, massive amounts of gold and silver out of the lands that they conquered. 16,000 tons of silver are taken out of the ground in the 16th century or from the hands of native peoples and shipped to Europe. This actually ended up inspiring many other nations to go to the Americas because they thought that they were going to find gold everywhere, which they did not. One specific place in South America called Potosi, there was literally a mountain of silver, and you can see an artist's representation there on the right. It was a mining town in 1570 that had the same population as the city of Paris at that time, just to give an idea of how intensive those operations were. In addition to mining, the Spanish were also interested in establishing haciendas. That was for the most part in North America, where they would raise cattle and grow cereal crops. And then we also have in a few places, we have the Spanish setting up sugar and tobacco plantations. In 1492, Spain came into existence when they unified their kingdom under Ferdinand and Isabella. And within 100 years, Spain becomes the most powerful country in Europe, primarily under Charles V. Who we have discussed before. Charles V is the Holy Roman Emperor, who also is the King of Spain and controls half of Italy. So, very powerful guy. And the main reason why he became powerful was because of the amount of gold and silver that were coming into Spain from the New World. They were able to conquer Portugal in 1580 and thus gain control of all of the Portuguese colonies as well. But their era of dominance starts to come to the end with the defeat of the Spanish Armada in the Anglo-Spanish War in 1588. There's a historical irony in the fact that Spain went to the Americas and destroyed just about every civilization it came into contact with and stripped them of all of their uh, wealth in gold and silver. And yet, all of that wealth in gold and silver ended up almost permanently damaging Spain as the result of that. Now, the Spanish throne took 20% of all of the gold and silver that came out of the New World. That was called the Royal Fifth. And they used that to finance all of the wars that they had fought in the 16th century all across Europe. But as we've talked about in a previous lecture, that Spain didn't take advantage of all of that new wealth. A lot of it disappeared through corruption, but perhaps more importantly, Spain never built a domestic manufacturing industry at all. They spent all of the wealth they took in either on financing war or on purchasing things from other European countries or even from East Asia. And so, once the money's gone, it's gone. Uh, Part of the problem also was massive inflation. Inflation is when prices of things go up faster than people's income goes up. And so if you have a lot of bread and very little gold, then bread's going to be fairly cheap. And if you have a lot of gold but not much bread, then bread's going to become very expensive. And that's kind of the problem, is that all of this gold comes in, all of this silver comes in, but for the average Spanish person, life actually got worse because the average Spaniard didn't have access to all of this gold and wealth and everything coming from the New World, but they did still have to buy bread. And so the costs get out of control in Spain, and there's an imbalance. And of course, once all of the gold is gone, then the Spanish economy declines as well. And Spain also didn't take advantage of emigration as opposed to immigration. Emigration starts with an E. They didn't take advantage of that. So, you have tons and tons of English people who end up emigrating to the Americas, but only 100,000 Spanish people ever went to the Americas in the entirety of the 16th century. So that's a lot lower than the other European countries that actually start settling in the Americas. France had very different priorities than Spain did. They were primarily focused on fishing, whaling, and fur trading. New France was initially built just around the St. Lawrence River in what is modern day Canada, and they were really focused on having positive relationships with Native Americans, and they were not interested in conquest at all. They needed to maintain those relationships to be able to maintain the fur trade, which is very lucrative in Europe because Europe in the wintertime is super cold. Whaling is primarily to get whale oil, which is used for lighting and other industrial purposes. And then again, those fisheries are there for food production. They did have disputes with England over parts of what is now Canada, specifically Hudson Bay and Newfoundland. Netherlands were a fairly new country when they got into the colony game, and in 1624 they founded a colony called New Amsterdam. It had settlements along the Hudson River in present-day New York, and it went all the way down through about the middle of New Jersey. Their focus was primarily on trade with the natives, so much closer to what the French were trying to do. And eventually they expanded their focus on trade to trading amongst the various colonies in the Americas. They did actually have slave plantations in the Hudson Valley, which is again sort of in central New York. They weren't growing cotton or tobacco or anything like that, but they were still using slave labor on their farms. New Netherland was conquered in the 1660s by the British, and they renamed it New York. And the image there is a map from the 1630s of lower Manhattan as it existed at the time. Obviously, we know that England plays a huge role in the development of European colonies in the Americas, but initially they were really only focused on the fisheries in the North Atlantic, same as the French. Partly due to the decline of the Hanseatic League, you lose that trade in fish. And so they need new sources of food. They're also looking for something called the Northwest Passage, which doesn't exist, but they thought that maybe there would be a sea route across the Americas because they didn't know how big the Americas were. into the Pacific Ocean so that they could get to the Spice Islands in East Asia. Uh, Again, it didn't work because it didn't exist. They were also looking for a northeast passage. They thought that they could sail across the very northern part of Russia, which you can't do because it's frozen most of the year. They moved on from those failed exploration efforts into the fur trade in Hudson Bay, but then they got into some conflicts with the French over who gets to engage in the fur trade where. Even though it was illegal, they also made money off of trade with the Spanish colonies. And in fact, Elizabeth I was secretly financing the slave trade, delivering slaves to the Caribbean. And then their first attempt at a permanent settlement in North America was called the Roanoke Colony in present day North Carolina, but it failed. And it was actually, it wasn't ever a legend because we knew about it, but nobody could ever find it for a long time, although ruins of it have been discovered fairly recently. The English Civil War had a huge impact on English colonization of the Americas because it's all sort of happening at the same time. And so, in the English Civil War, as you know, there's a division between Parliament and the King, but that also sorted out as being the Puritans versus the aristocrats. The aristocracy supported the king. Many of the more active members of parliament were also Puritans. Again, Puritans from like Thanksgiving, but we're really talking about religious radicals trying to overturn English society. Parliament won that war, at least the first sort of round of it, and they executed the king in 1649. And then we get this split within the colonies. So New England was settled by the Puritans, and so they're heavily aligned with that. They also believe in representative government, and so they also support the concept of having a parliament, whereas Virginia was settled by the aristocracy, and so they're much more aligned with the monarchy. The first permanent settlement that lasted in the Americas, English settlement in the Americas, was Jamestown, which was founded in 1607 by the Virginia Company. This is another one of those joint stock or chartered companies. It was effectively a corporate owned military base, right? So it's not the British Army. It's sort of like, it's essentially like private, military contractors like we have today, mercenary, and they're there to look for gold because all of this gold is coming out of the Americas. The Spanish mostly have control over, and so everybody wants to find gold. There's no gold in Virginia. Spoiler. The colony wasn't meant to be self-sustaining. It wasn't meant to be like a permanent farming colony. The expectation is they would search for gold, and then the company would bring in supplies to help them in that effort. That didn't really happen. Crossing the Atlantic is hard, and so you have this massive death rate. Only 1,200 of 7,200 people who came to Jamestown survived the first 17 years. So that's not great. Um, if you've ever seen the movie Pocahontas, then you have probably experienced the idea that John Smith, the leader of the Jamestown colony, was a good guy. History would disagree with that. He got into this cycle of violence with the Powhatan Confederacy, and the Powhatan was confused because he thought that Jamestown was a tributary. It was subordinate to him and to his political organization. Needless to say, Europeans didn't see it in quite the same way, and so you start seeing fighting, and first it's skirmishes, and then you get into full-on massacres on both sides. But ultimately, the English had the numbers because there's a lot more people in England, and every time a Native American fighter dies, they can't really replace them as easily because remember, the Native populations are also dealing with infectious diseases coming from Europe. But just to prove how evil the English were, at least in the way that they related with Native peoples, is they organized a treaty and they said, hey, let's come and celebrate this treaty. And the natives were like, cool, let's go. We have a treaty and now we're going to stop fighting. And the English served drinks that were poisoned. And so they killed every native person that came to the celebration of a treaty. So, yeah, not the greatest people. Looking a little bit more at the Virginia colony, what we see is again, it is settled by the aristocracy, but it's by the younger sons of the aristocracy because you have what's called male primogeniture, which is the eldest son inherits. So, if you're a lord and you have three sons and then you die and your eldest son gets all of the land there, then what are those other two sons going to do? Well, now they have a place to go. They can go to Virginia and they can set up their own kind of feudal plantation and live a life that they probably never could have lived in England because there's just so much more land, right? So after the Royalists are defeated in the Civil War, the English Civil War, then you have even more. Of the petty nobles or the younger sons of the aristocracy coming to America. Now they bring their culture with them, of course. So they're setting up these sort of feudal plantation structures, but they also want a legislature. So they established that, and the legislature that is established in Virginia has been operating ever since it was first established, and it is now the Virginia State House. That is the exact same legislature that was founded in the early 1600s. They didn't have any towns in Virginia. They didn't need a town because the plantations were designed to be self-sufficient. So they had everything that they needed. And they didn't even need a port because there are so many interior waterways in the coast of Virginia that every plantation could have its own access to water. And so ships that are, bringing whatever the agricultural products are, probably starting with tobacco, the ship can just come right up alongside the plantation and load. And so the idea here was that this was a what we call a gentleman's utopia. It was like the perfect possible society for wealthy aristocrats. They have everything that they need. So the economy really takes off in 1617 when somebody gets the bright idea to plant tobacco. As we know, tobacco has an addictive drug called nicotine in it, and this is just another example of the British getting involved in the drugs trade because just like sugar is a drug and they're producing sugar for export back to Europe, now they're producing tobacco to export it back to Europe. Needless to say, it was very, very popular. Um, and so now the economy really starts to take off, but you need a workforce. And so the first workforce that was used in the Virginia colony were poor people from England, right? This is indentured servitude, which you might remember from a previous course. 80% of all immigrants coming to the Virginia colony were indentured servants, and there was a very high mortality rate. And these are human beings that are being treated like animals. Um, that's the concept of chattel is you are livestock. But if you manage to survive the period in which you were in servitude, which was usually somewhere between 7 and 10 years, you would automatically get 50 acres of land, and you could end up being quite successful, growing tobacco and selling it. So there was this opportunity at the end of essentially being a slave. But by the 1670s, there weren't that many Englishmen who wanted to travel to the Americas to be indentured servants. There were newer opportunities that were opening up, and so then you need a new labor force, and so this is the moment when we start to see enslaved Africans being transported to North America, starting in 1619, and what they ended up doing is they just took the practices that they used with indentured servants and then they applied them to slaves. But there was no economic downside there because you didn't then end up having to give people land after 10 years or whatever. But the idea that human beings are equivalent to animals, that concept comes out of how the English treated indentured servants, and it's the most brutal form of slavery in the history of mankind. Slavery in ancient Rome, uh, slaves still had some basic fundamental rights. So we'll take a shot at the European colonies in South America in 1650. So you can see that dividing line between the territory that the Portuguese controlled versus the territory that the Spanish controlled. Now you can see that there are some Dutch colonies in there, because this is the point at which the Dutch are starting to kick the Portuguese tail in various places. And so they take this from a much more weak Portugal in around 1650. Here is settlement in North America, North and Central America in 1650. So you can see there, New Spain is huge. And then you have various smaller settlements in North America. You see that strip of New France along the St. Lawrence River, and then you've got a little bit in New Amsterdam and the British colonies and so forth. And then we jump ahead to 1750, and you can see how the vast majority of North and South America have been carved up by the Europeans. There's very little land, and it's mostly inhospitable, other than perhaps the Pacific Northwest. And so there are no Europeans competing at this point for those land. But this is a little trivia point. If you see up there in Alaska, that was controlled by the Russians. The United States bought Alaska from the Russians in the latter part of the 19th century. So you see a lot of European countries have at least a little bit of land in the Americas. Thank you for staying to the end of my presentation. Feel free to check out one of the other videos.